Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to sift through stacks of information and pull out those really crucial nuggets of knowledge for you. And today, wow, we're embarking on a truly mind-bending exploration. We've got a fascinating set of sources here that, well, they challenge our fundamental understanding of the Earth's shape. Our mission really is to unpack a pretty compelling argument laid out in these specific materials, the claim that the Earth isn't a globe, but actually a flat plane. We'll be looking into things like old maps, some pretty impressive engineering feats, travel logs, even astronomical observations, all presented through a lens that meticulously tries to pinpoint alleged inconsistencies with the globe model.
Yeah, what's really fascinating is how these sources build their case. It's sort of piece by piece, often using evidence that, many people might just take for granted. And just to be clear, we're not here to endorse any particular viewpoint. Our goal is simply to present, as neutrally as we can, the precise claims and the arguments that are laid out in the material provided to us. So get ready for maybe some aha moments, or at least some moments that make you go, because this deep dive, it's definitely packed with surprising details and questions you might not have thought about before.
Okay, let's kick things off then. Let's unpack this with some real-world engineering projects. Our sources, they present a whole series of detailed examples, and the core claim is that major construction projects on Earth just don't seem to account for curvature, which, if the Earth were a globe, they absolutely should, right?
Right. That really raises the immediate question. If we live on a sphere, how are engineers building these massive things that stretch for miles and miles, without constantly adjusting for a pretty significant drop?
Exactly. So let's take the Erie Canal in New York as a first example. The sources pinpoint this 62-mile stretch from Lockport to Rochester, and they say the water only descends about 3 feet over that entire distance.
3 feet over 62 miles.
Yeah. But if you calculate the curvature for a globe of accepted dimensions, that distance should have a fall of something like 640 feet from the midpoint down to the ends.
A huge difference.
A massive difference. And the argument presented is, well, the engineers simply didn't dig down hundreds of feet in the middle section.
And there's another section they mentioned, right? Syracuse to York Mills.
Yes, 53 miles long. And apparently that shows no drop at all. Both ends are measured at just under 427 feet above tidewater.
Okay, and the globe prediction for that distance?
Around 450 feet, 8 inches of curve at the midpoint. Again, the sources insist no significant digging like that was needed.
It's pretty striking. And what's interesting is how this ties into historical engineering practices they highlight.
Yeah.
There's this mention of British law, the House of Commons Standing Orders, Order 55 specifically.
Ah, yes, the datum horizontal line.
Exactly. It apparently required this perfectly level, straight reference line for long projects. And crucially, it had to be, quote, the same throughout the whole length of the work. The sources interpret this as basically implying an assumption of flatness, baked right into the engineering standards.
Interesting. And it's not just canals, is it? The Suez Canal comes up too.
It does. Described as 100 miles of, quote, dead level surface water. No locks, no allowance made for Earth's curvature, according to the material.
So 100 miles, dead level. What's the globe calculation there?
Well, the sources calculate that on a standard globe model, that canal would necessitate a curve of over 6,600 feet.
6,600 feet.
Yeah, or think of it as a convexity, like a bulge in the middle of about 1,666 feet at the 50-mile midpoint.
Wow.
Now, the counter-argument, the standard explanation, involves the equipotential water and gravity theory. Basically, water follows the curve due to gravity.
Right, that makes intuitive sense on a globe.
It does. But the sources we're looking at dismiss this. They argue it kind of defies logic when you're talking about the sheer scale of these constructions and the precision needed.
Okay, so canals? What else? Railways?
Railways, too. The London Northwestern Railway. It's 180 miles long, connecting London to Liverpool. And the claim here centers on the midpoint, Birmingham. It was measured at 240 feet above this horizontal datum line we mentioned.
Okay, 240 feet above the baseline.
But calculated on a globe model, and that midpoint should be, get this, over 5,400 feet above that same line.
5,400 compared to 240.
Exactly. That's a difference of, well, more than 10 times the height of the Empire State Building, just to put it in perspective. The sources present this as a major anomaly.
That is a stark difference.
Oh.
Okay, one more engineering example they brought up was about laying undersea cables, right? The Transatlantic Cable Survey.
Yes, from 1869, connecting Valencia, Ireland to Trinity Bay, Newfoundland. That's a distance of about 1,665 nautical miles. During the survey, the deepest point they measured was around 14,500 feet.
Okay, sounds deep.
It is deep, But here's the claim from the sources. On a globe, the center of the ocean between those 2 points should actually be almost 120 miles higher than the coastlines due to the curve.
120 miles higher.
That's the calculation presented. And it would mean the deepest point, theoretically, should be closer to 640,000 feet deep.
It's 640,000 compared to 14,000.
It's a colossal difference, yeah. Roughly 44 times deeper than what they actually measured, according to these calculations.
And wasn't there something about the amount of cable used?
Yes, that's another key point they make. The ship laid 1,852 miles of cable for a journey charted at 1,665 miles. The sources argue this excess cable is impossible on a globe model. Why? Because you'd actually be laying cable over a shorter distance due to the curve, not needing more cable.
Right, that makes sense if you picture laying it over a sphere. So that's quite a collection of engineering arguments. Thinking about this, what does it all mean for you, the listener, and how you might think about how our world is built? From the source's viewpoint, it points to a fundamental disconnect. If these huge projects operate without accounting for curvature, well, that starkly challenges the idea of a spherical Earth in practice, doesn't it?
It certainly raises some intriguing questions about geometry on a grand scale, based on the evidence presented in these documents.
Okay, let's shift gears now. Let's talk about Antarctica. This is where, according to our sources, things get really interesting, maybe even a bit weird. They actually call it Fantasy Island. The claims here touch on everything from old maps, modern technology, to geographical impossibilities.
Yeah, and if you connect this to the bigger picture they're painting, the way Antarctica is portrayed, measured, or perhaps mismeasured becomes a real linchpin in their whole argument. They're essentially suggesting that if you can show discrepancies or manipulation related to Antarctica, it helps unravel the larger globe narrative.
So where do they start with Antarctica? Old maps, you said.
That's right. They point to things like Martin Behaim's globe from 1482, which shows a circulus Antarcticus, and also a 1766 flat Earth map by someone named Dill showing Terrara, Antarctica.
And the significance.
Both of these predate the commonly cited 1820 discovery of Antarctica. So the sources use this to suggest, hey, maybe its existence, or at least something down there, was known much earlier than the official story tells us.
Okay, interesting historical point. But what about more direct physical observations?
A really key argument revolves around the 24-hour sun phenomenon, or the lack thereof, depending on where you are. We know Hammerfest, Norway, way up at 70 degrees north, it gets a full 24-hour sun in summer. That's well documented.
Right, the midnight sun.
Exactly. But then they look south. They cited J. Morrison from the Nautical Almanac Office back in 1889. He stated that for South Shetland, supposedly at the equivalent latitude of 70 degrees south, the longest day was actually under 20 hours, meaning it still had over 4 hours of no sun, even at peak summer.
Wait, so not 24 hours of sun?
Not according to this 1889 source. And this, the current material argues, directly contradicts the globe model. Because a globe should have mirrored phenomena, right? 24-hour sun at 70 north should mean 24-hour sun at 70 south.
If it doesn't, that's a problem for the symmetry argument.
That's precisely their point. They argue this isn't just about the sun, it challenges a fundamental physical property expected of a globe, this symmetry between the poles, which they claim doesn't hold up down south.
Okay, that's a specific observational claim. How does this connect to modern tech, like GPS?
This is where it gets even stranger, according to the sources. They highlight an alleged shift in latitude for South Shetland itself. Remember, the 1889 almanacs placed it at 70 degrees south, but modern GPS and Google Earth, they show it around 62.5 degrees south.
62.5, that's a huge difference. How far is that?
It's about 517 miles, a massive shift. And meanwhile, Hammerfest's latitude up north has apparently remained consistent throughout this time.
So the claim is the coordinates themselves changed.
That's the claim. And it leads them to ask, well, how could mariners possibly navigate accurately for decades if the charts were off by hundreds of miles? It raises serious questions about the consistency and reliability of our geographic data, particularly for the southern regions.
And this skepticism extends to satellites, too.
It does. The sources express, let's say, considerable doubt about satellites in orbit. They go so far as to suggest they might be just cameras attached to solar panels and balloons.
Balloons?
Right.
Really, what's the reasoning?
They point to alleged technical problems, like issues with achieving clear focus or stable images, given the supposed shutter speeds needed at orbital velocities and distances. They question the physics of it.
Okay. And what about the images we do see, like from NASA?
They claim those are often composite images that show distortions. For example, they allege the United States appears drastically different in size in different NASA images, sometimes looking half the size of the Earth, or appearing to quadruple in size over just 15 years between different official pictures.
So questioning the visual evidence itself.
Yes. And adding to this skepticism about official data, they point out that Google Earth allegedly makes it difficult, or even impossible, to accurately measure the perimeter and area of Antarctica.
How so?
They claim it's blanked out or restricted, and that the figures sometimes given like an 11,550-mile perimeter and 5 million square mile area are contradictory and seem suspiciously small compared to how large Antarctica should be relative to, say, the U.S. on a globe model.
Right, okay. Lots of claims about mapping and imaging discrepancies. What about travel? Flight paths?
Flight paths are another major focus. They cite flights to Antarctica as evidence. For instance, a flight from Christchurch, New Zealand to McMurdo Station. On a globe that's basically a straight shot south, roughly 2,340 miles. For a typical C-17 cargo plane, you'd expect that to take about 4.5 hours.
Okay, sounds reasonable.
But the sources state the actual flight time is consistently around 6 hours. This averages out to only 441 miles per hour, which is significantly slower than the plane's normal cruising speed.
Slower, implying maybe the distance is longer?
That's the implication. And what makes it even more puzzling, they say, is a BBC graphic they found. It supposedly showed the flight path going way out east over the Antarctic Peninsula in the South Atlantic just to get to McMurdo, which is in the South Pacific sector.
That sounds like a massive detour on a globe.
Completely illogical on a globe, they argue. They present these flight time and path discrepancies as strong evidence that the actual distances involved are far greater than a globe allows for.
Is there another flight example?
Yes, Punta Arenas, Chile to Union Glacier Camp in Antarctica. A Boeing 757 typically makes this flight. The alleged globe distance is 1,876 miles. The flight takes about 4 hours and 15 minutes. Again, if you calculate the average speed, it comes out to around 441 miles per hour.
The same slow speed.
And the same unusually slow speed. The 757's cruising speed is closer to 590 miles per hour. So again, the sources suggest the actual distance must be much longer, perhaps closer to 2,520 miles, which they say fits better with calculations on something like the Gleason Flat Earth map.
Okay, so flight data. What about older travel, like ships?
Yes, they connect this to historical steamship travel logs, especially comparing North Atlantic routes to South Atlantic and Southern Ocean routes. North Atlantic routes, like New York to Southampton, were pretty consistent. About 3,060 nautical miles, taking around 6.5 days. Ships averaging 18-19 knots. Pretty standard.
Okay, baseline established. Now the South.
Big difference, according to the logs they cite from a navigator named Charles B. Brown. Take Cape Town to Buenos Aires. Old globes apparently showed it as 3,600 nautical miles. Google Earth says about 3,777. But Brown's actual logs, they showed 4,560 nautical miles.
That's nearly 1,000 miles longer than Google Earth.
Exactly. And what's more, the fastest ships on that southern route only averaged about 11 to 11.3 knots. Much slower than the northern ships, despite covering what globes claim are similar or even shorter distances.
Slower speeds and longer log distances.
That's the pattern they highlight. It suggests, according to the sources, that southern hemisphere distances are significantly underestimated on globe maps.
Is there another southern route example?
Even more dramatic is Cape Town to Cape Horn. Old globes, around 3,400 nautical miles. Google Earth, about 3,600. But Brown's logs, a massive 5,700 nautical miles.
Wow, over 2,000 miles more than the official distance.
Yes, and the fastest ship they mention on this route, the Abbeytown, took nearly 14 days to make the journey. Far, far longer than you'd expect if the Google Earth distances were accurate.
So the argument is the logs don't match the maps.
Precisely. And they emphasize that Navigator Brown's charts apparently use the same coordinates as Google Earth does today. The latitudes and longitudes matched. But his distance calculations based on those coordinates were vastly different. This leads the sources to suggest that Google Earth, and by extension the globe model it represents, must somehow fudge the display or the distances in the southern hemisphere.
Okay, that's quite an accusation based on those logs. Is there anything more contemporary, like whistleblower accounts?
There is one mentioned, yes, a story nicknamed Frostbite. It details an alleged journey by someone on a military boat from Colombia, South America. The route went via Hawaii, then the Philippines, and then down to McMurdo Station in Antarctica. And the journey took, quote, more than 2 weeks.
Colombia, Hawaii, Philippines, Antarctica, that sounds incredibly roundabout on a globe.
Exactly. The sources present this as totally illogical on a globe. where a direct south path from Columbia would be maybe 8 days or so. But, they argue, this seemingly bizarre route makes perfect sense if you trace it on the Gleason flat Earth map, suggesting it was perhaps a necessary path for resupply following coastlines or manageable sea routes on that model.
Very interesting claim. What about the continent itself? Are there claims about accessibility or what's actually at the South Pole?
Yes, several. First, there's the claim that basically no permanent bases exist inside the 80 degrees south latitude range,
None at all.
with the single notable exception of the alleged Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station itself. They note Vostok Station is quite far out. It's 78 degrees 27 minutes south. And they bring up historical accounts, citing the 9th edition of Encyclopedia Britannica, which apparently described early expeditions consistently failing to get past roughly 78 degrees south, encountering what was described as an enormous, insurpassable ice wall.
An ice wall, echoes of some common flat Earth tropes there.
Indeed. But then they focus heavily on the Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station itself, presenting it as a major point of contradiction.
How so? What are the contradictions?
Well, first, coordinates. They claim different sources give conflicting locations. Wikipedia allegedly puts it squarely at 90 degrees south, 0 degrees east-west. But a site called Date and Time apparently gives coordinates that equate to about 900 feet away from that point. And then Google Earth, according to them, places the marker for the station way off at 85 degrees 6 minutes south, 0 degrees west, which is over 300 miles away from the supposed pole.
300 miles? That's not a small error.
Not at all. And it's not just location, it's elevation too. They list discrepancies there as well. Scott's journal mentioned 9,500 feet. Google Earth apparently shows 8,343 feet. Wikipedia says 9,301 feet. And they even found a CGI map showing it between 2,600 and 3,300 feet.
Wildly different numbers.
Completely different. The sources seize on this, arguing it proves there is no single verifiable physical South Pole point and that the station must be misrepresenting both its location and its elevation.
And this ties back to the historical expeditions. Amundsen and Scott.
Yes, they question the veracity of those famous expeditions, too. They cite things like alleged inconsistencies in photos, questioning how photos were taken without tracks from a self-timer setup, for instance. They also point to supposed issues with journal dates and the sheer implausibility, they argue, of seeing a flag miles away across a supposedly curved surface.
So challenging the historical record itself.
Correct. And they further argue that the routes those expeditions took, coming via New Zealand and the Ross Ice Shelf, only really make geographical sense if you plot them on the Gleason flat Earth map, not on a globe where more direct routes would seem logical.
Wow. Okay, so the Antarctica section is full of claims about mapping errors, travel time anomalies, coordinate confusion, and even challenges to historical accounts. It certainly paints a picture of Antarctica that's very, very different from the one most of us probably hold. It definitely makes you wonder, how certain facts become established and then maintained over time. So we've heard about engineering, we've heard about Antarctica. This leads to the big question: why? Why, according to these sources, would such alleged deceptions exist? They delve into potential motivations for maintaining what they call the globe lie, and they also offer alternative explanations for things we observe in the world.
Exactly. This is crucial. What's the proposed purpose behind maintaining such a grand, potentially false narrative? And importantly, how did the alternative models presented in these sources attempt to explain observations that seem to confirm the globe, or at least challenge the flat model?
Okay, so first, the motivation. What do the sources suggest?
One prominent angle presented is what they term the copyright commerce angle. It's a bit complex. But the claim is essentially that powerful entities, maybe mentioning the Vatican or royal families, maintain a kind of conceptual copyright over fundamental aspects of our reality.
Copyright over what?
Over things like our names, through birth certificates perhaps, dates, specifically citing the Gregorian calendar, and even places represented by the spinning globe model itself. And the purpose of this alleged copyright, according to the sources, is to underpin and enable their systems of taxation, commerce, and control. Maintaining the globe lie, in this view, is essential to maintaining that system.
That's quite a claim, a system of control based on the shape of the Earth.
It's definitely one of the core motivations presented in the material, yes.
Okay. Beyond that motivation, what about evidence for alternative models? They mentioned practical engineering again.
They do circle back to practical engineering as everyday evidence supporting their view. They highlight the continued use of sextants, for example. Sextants rely on plane trigonometry, flat planes for calculations, and apparently require no adjustments for Earth's curvature to work accurately over distances.
And laser levels, things like that.
Yes, laser levels used in construction, the methods used by train track builders, even calculations allegedly used by pilots. The sources claim these all operate on assumptions of flatness in practice. It's presented as sort of common sense, ground level evidence against the globe.
And they briefly touch on NASA again, right? Something about the moon landing.
Yes, the assertion that the moon landing was fake is mentioned in the context of discrediting NASA generally. If NASA's crowning achievement is questioned, the sources imply, then their other claims about space, including the shape of the Earth, become less credible.
Okay. What about alternative ways of looking at the cosmos? Astrology came up.
It did. They present a perspective attributed to Rosicrucianism regarding astrology. It's an interesting nuance. The view presented is that, while heliocentricity, sun-centered model, might be considered, scientifically speaking, incorrect by them, geocentric astrology, Earth-centered, is still seen as valid.
How can both be true in their view?
Because, they argue, geocentric astrology works based on empirical knowledge and the observed truth of its predictions. It values direct experience and observed outcomes over what they seem to dismiss as scientism or perhaps rigid adherence to a specific scientific model like heliocentrism.
So prioritizing observed results over theoretical models.
That seems to be the gist of that particular point.
Okay, let's talk about the sun. That's obviously a huge factor. How do the sources challenge the standard view of the sun?
Several ways. First, scale. They criticize illustrations of the sun and Earth, calling it neurographics programming. The claim is these drawings never show the true scale. On the accepted model, Earth should be depicted something like 11,700 times its own diameter away from the sun, not, just 2 or 3 diameters away as often shown.
So the visual representations are misleading.
Deeply misleading and conditioning, they argue. Then there's the appearance of sun rays. They point to crepuscular rays, those beams of sunlight that seem to fan out from behind clouds.
Yeah, you see those quite often.
Right. The sources argue these rays are clearly fanning out in a pyramid shape. They say this is consistent with a relatively small local light source, not with parallel rays coming from a massive, incredibly distant sun, which should appear parallel.
Interesting point about perspective there. Do they use specific locations to illustrate sun behavior?
Yes. Lake Pukaki in New Zealand, down at 44 degrees south latitude, is used as a key example to challenge the globe model's sun path. They acknowledge the sun's apparent movement between the tropics overhead at Capricorn in December, Cancer in June, the equator in March and September.
Okay, standard observation.
But here's the puzzle they pose. Take December 4th. The sun is technically north of Lake Pukaki, about 1,472 miles north, heading towards the Tropic of Capricorn further south. Yet observers at Lake Pukaki see the sunrise coming from the south-southeast, and the sunset happens in the west-southwest.
Wait, the sun is physically north, but rises and sets towards the south? How does that work?
That's the question they raise, and it gets strange around the equinoxes March 21st or September 21st. The sun is directly over the equator, much further north of Lake Pukaki. At solar noon, the sun's altitude at Pukaki is 45 degrees, confirming it's in the northern part of the sky relative to the observer. Makes sense.
Okay.
But even then, the sunrise is still observed coming from the south-southeast, and sunset is still west-southwest.
So even when the sun is definitely far to the north, it appears to rise and set from southerly directions.
That's the claim based on observation reports they cite. And the flat Earth explanation they offer is quite different. They suggest east and west aren't straight lines, but actually curve around in a circle on a flat plane. And they propose the sun's light maybe penetrates differently or appears to bend in what they call the more rarefied southern atmosphere. This atmospheric effect, they argue, causes the apparent angles of sunrise and sunset to seem like they're coming from the south, even when the sun itself is physically located to the north of the observer on the flat plane.
Okay, that's a complex alternative explanation involving atmospheric optics and a different geometry. What about Earth's spin? How do they address that?
They challenge the standard model of a spinning globe with a synchronized atmosphere moving along with it. The main point of contention is wind patterns. They argue the globe model doesn't adequately explain why we have prevailing westerly trade winds in the northern hemisphere, but the opposing easterly roaring 40s winds in the southern hemisphere.
Different directions seem counterintuitive if the whole atmosphere is spinning together west to east.
That's their argument. To explain these opposing winds and also how star trails appear to move differently depending on your location, they propose a different model. An etheric toroidal field, Earth.
A toroidal field. Like a donut shape.
Sort of an energy field shaped like a donut surrounding or perhaps encompassing the Earth. They suggest this field, rather than simple physical spin, governs atmospheric movements and maybe even celestial appearances. It's definitely a more esoteric concept.
It sounds like it. Okay, going back to Antarctica briefly, any other points about the pole itself?
Yes, they flatly state that the concept of 90 degrees south latitude is just, quote, a Newtonian physics globe theory and assumption, not a proven fact. The implication being that the South Polar region, or the ice, could potentially extend much further than the globe model allows for. There might not be a single point pole.
And there was mention of an ice dome.
Yes, but they clarify this. An old encyclopedia mentioned a dome 13,000 feet high in Antarctica. The sources clarify this refers to a known geological feature, a massive glacial ice dome on the ground, like Dome Fuji, which exists today and is about 12,500 feet high. It's not, they stress, a physical dome structure in the sky covering the Earth.
Ah, okay. Important clarification. So not a literal sky dome.
Correct. Finally, they offer a really alternative perspective on the sun itself, moving beyond just its position.
What's that?
The idea that the sun might not even be a physical, tangible object in the way we usually think. Maybe it's more metaphysical.
Metaphysical, like how?
Like a phenomenon perhaps similar to a rainbow or wind,
Yeah.
something you observe but can't physically touch or land on. They float ideas like it being a mirror projection from some central permanent vortex, or maybe an electrical charge phenomenon occurring between different fields or layers of the atmosphere.
So detaching the sun from being a giant ball of gas millions of miles away.
Exactly. It's offered as a way to potentially reconcile some of the observational paradoxes they raise, like the sun's apparent path or the nature of its rays, without relying on the standard model.
And this ties back to the 24-hour Antarctic sun claims.
Yes, they reiterate that the claimed 24-hour sun at coastal Antarctic bases like Rothera or Mawson is impossible based on their understanding of latitude and the sun's movement on a non-globe model.
Yeah.
Yet it's widely reported by those bases and in travel logs. So how do they explain that observation?
Good question.
They propose a theory involving a condensed air atmospheric movie screen effect occurring around the 80 degrees south latitude mark. This, they suggest, might create the illusion of a 24-hour sun, projecting light or creating bright conditions even when the sun itself isn't physically above the horizon according to their model.
An atmospheric projection, like a mirage.
Something like that, perhaps. And they contrast modern claims about needing intense sunglasses in Antarctica with historical expedition journals from Scott's era, which they say rarely, if ever, mention sunglasses or severe sunburn, suggesting maybe conditions or perceptions were different.
Okay, well, we have certainly taken a deep dive today. We've explored some really profound and yet often quite challenging claims from these source materials. A perspective suggesting our understanding of the Earth might be fundamentally different from what most of us were taught.
It's truly striking, isn't it? How the source material uses these very detailed, often technical-sounding examples from history, engineering, navigation, observation to construct its case. Regardless of whether one agrees, it definitely encourages you to question assumptions and maybe look at familiar information through a very different lens.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener, the learner? I think it's a powerful reminder, really, that there are almost always multiple perspectives, different interpretations of reality out there. Whether you find these specific claims convincing or not, the level of detail, the specific anomalies pointed out in these sources, they're certainly thought-provoking, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, and it brings up that broader, important question. In today's world, just awash with information from all sides, how do you personally decide what's fact, what's theory, what's interpretation, and what truly stands up to scrutiny when you dig into it?
That's the challenge, isn't it? We encourage you to ponder these ideas we discussed today. Maybe revisit your own understanding of some of these examples. Canals, flight paths, Antarctica. Perhaps even look into the source material these claims come from yourself, if you're curious. After all, the deeper you dive, the more you discover.